Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Welcome to the programme. The criticism from your party, from the Labour Party, is that this Chancellor may well appear to be a low-growth, high-tax Chancellor. He'll clearly be wanting to challenge that assumption today, pointing to the history of growth, but also potentially moving on some of these tax rises. Is that going to weaken the Labour attack line, do you think, in the future?
Well, I don't think so, because it isn't about just this Chancellor. It's also, let's be honest, it's also about previous 10 years before he became the Chancellor. So this isn't today isn't day zero, as he was suggesting yesterday. So now's the time to get on. COVID's gone. I'm afraid they were in power 10 years before COVID. So this idea that somehow let's put all in the past, let's put all that in the past and sort of pretend we're just starting here on in. If only, I'm afraid that's not going to happen. So we've got this short-term crisis, as alluded to by your previous speaker, and of course we've got both the medium and the long-term crisis, and you've got to deal with both. And I'm not quite sure that he's managing to do either at this particular stage. And so we've got a situation where his taxes have gone up in the last 2 years by about £25 billion a year. And what have we got for it? Not a great deal. What's his plan for long-term investment? There isn't a plan for long-term investment. Your colleague, the previous speaker, talked about low productivity. Yes, we're 35% less productive than the Germans, 25% less productive than the French, 10% less productive than the Italians. And he's really got to get to grips with that issue about slow, patient investment over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. That's how we're going to get out of this problem.
A lot of people point to the productivity issue as a number of factors. Number one, investment, as we were speaking about a little bit earlier, but also number two, housing. The fact that people can't live where they're most productive, the fact that people might want to live in bigger conurbations but have to spend hours of their day travelling to work every single day, that clearly affects productivity. Do you expect that this government might be able to do anything about housing?
That's a sort of a more longer-term issue, and I think we've got that the wrong way around. What we have to do is we are also, in terms of productivity, regionally the most unequal in terms of productivity in Western Europe. So that's a long-term issue that you've got to get to grips with, and that does need investment in the infrastructure, whether it be the digital infrastructure or the rail infrastructure, for example, or in other parts of the infrastructure, like we have in Merseyside, we have turbines on the river, for example. You need that sort of massive investment over the years right across the country, both in terms of regions and in sectors. Because it's not just about regions, it's about the sectoral inequalities and productivity as well, and you've got to deal with that. Your colleague, or the former speaker, said before, in relation to tax reliefs, we already have best part of £450 billion worth of tax reliefs. And putting another tax relief into the system without a complete, thorough review of those other tax reliefs, like entrepreneurs' tax relief and billions of pounds worth of other tax reliefs, is just going to kick the can down the road. So it's a fundamental review, for example, of that £450 billion worth of tax reliefs as well.
It is interesting talking about this from a philosophical point of view, the idea of something being a tax relief, i.e. the government choosing to not take as much money away from an individual or a business as they were doing before. Surely that's just allowing people to keep more of their money. That's not a spend from the government. That's the government taking less. That seems to be something that Keir Starmer was leaning towards, the idea that money is people's money, not government money, the idea of fiscal responsibility. Is the Labour Party trying to take some of that ground now?
I think what it's trying to say is that it has to be a fairer approach to the tax system. We've got a sclerotic tax system in this country. And as I said, the government raises about £840 billion a year out of the 2.2 trillion the country, in a sense, earns, so to speak. And it has an additional £450 billion of the tax reliefs. Now, without getting it all too complicated, you have to have a look at that structure, the structure of the tax system as well, to ensure that it is fair right across the board. That's the point. So that's why we're coming to the issue about, for example, the oil and gas companies. That's why we need a windfall tax. At the end of the day, they've been not paying a vast amounts of tax, and in fact, when they do pay tax, they've been getting quite considerable tax reliefs on that. So there's almost like a neutral effect on the oil companies. And a final point in relation to that, we take about £2 a barrel in terms of licence off the oil companies. In Norway, in their fields, it's £17 a barrel, something like $17 a barrel. That doesn't stop the disinvestment. It's got to be fairer. It's got to be a fairer approach to tax.